Sometimes the weight of a man's past becomes too heavy to carry alone. Sometimes a soul so broken finds one last chance to build something worth remembering. Emmett Cain was a gunslinger who left nothing but graves behind him. A man who drifted through 62 years with blood on his hands and regret in his heart. When he stumbled upon an abandoned hospital at the edge of a dying town, he had $100 and nothing left to lose. What he did next would transform not just that crumbling building, but an entire community that had forgotten how to hope. But when the woman from his darkest chapter appeared at his door, Emmett faced the hardest question of all. Can a man truly outrun what he's done? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust rose in small clouds beneath the hooves of Emmett Cain's horse as he rode into Pale Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late September. The animal was old, like its rider, and both moved with the careful economy of creatures who understood their best years lay behind them. Emmett sat the saddle with his back straight out of habit rather than pride, his eyes taking in the town with the practiced observation of a man who had seen too many places just like this one. Pale Ridge was dying. That much was clear before he even reached the first buildings. The paint peeled from storefronts like old skin. Windows stared vacant where glass had broken and never been replaced. A tumbleweed caught against a hitching post, and nobody bothered to clear it away. The wooden sidewalks, once bustling with commerce and community, now echoed hollow under the few footsteps that crossed them. Emmett was 62 years old, though his face carried the marks of harder miles than that. His beard was more silver than dark, trimmed close but not particularly neat. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and fanned from the corners of his eyes, not from laughter but from squinting into too many suns across too many horizons. His hands, resting easy on the saddle horn, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had worked hard and fought harder. He wore a long duster coat, the color of prairie dust, and beneath it a vest over a faded blue shirt. His hat was wide-brimmed and weathered, pulled low enough to shade his eyes. At his hip rode a Colt revolver in a worn holster, positioned for a draw he hoped he would never need to make again. The gun was clean and oiled, because old habits die harder than old men. But Emmett had not fired it in anger for nearly a decade. The town square, such as it was, centered on a dry fountain where water no longer flowed. A few people moved about their business, giving him sidelong glances, but no greetings. Strangers were watched in small towns, and this stranger had the look of someone carrying weight that could not be seen. Emmett guided his horse to the hitching post outside what appeared to be the general store. The sign above the door read, "Mendez Mercantile," in faded letters. He dismounted slowly, feeling the stiffness in his lower back, and tied the reins with hands that moved automatically through motions performed 10,000 times before. Inside, the store was dim and smelled of coffee, flour, and old wood. Shelves lined the walls, stocked but not full, everything arranged with care even if there was not much to arrange. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back from a face that was handsome rather than pretty, marked by sun and the particular weariness that comes from weathering difficult years without complaint. "Help you?" she asked. Her voice was neutral, not unwelcoming but not warm either. "Coffee, if you have it," Emmett said. "And any news about rooms for rent?" "Coffee's 2 bits a cup." She reached for a pot on the small stove behind her. "As for rooms, Mrs. Fletcher runs a boarding house 2 streets over. Blue house with the porch." Obliged, Emmett accepted the cup she poured and wrapped his hands around its warmth. The coffee was strong and bitter, and he drank it without complaint. The woman studied him with the directness common to people who had stopped worrying about social niceties. "Passing through? Maybe, maybe not." Emmett took another sip. "Name's Emmett Cain. Clara Mendez." She did not offer her hand, and he did not extend his. "What brings you to Pale Ridge, Mr. Cain?" "We're not on the way to anywhere useful." Notice that. He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Sometimes a man ends up where he ends up, not where he planned. Clara nodded as though this made perfect sense to her. That building on the hill, the old hospital. You come about that? Emmett's eyes sharpened slightly. What makes you ask? Because it's the only thing in Pale Ridge that might interest a stranger, and the only thing nobody wants to talk about. She refilled his cup without asking. Been empty 20 years now. Every few years, someone gets ideas about it, but nothing ever comes of those ideas. Why's that? Clara's expression grew distant. Place has a history. Bad things happened there toward the end. Folks died who shouldn't have, from neglect more than disease. Town likes to pretend it doesn't exist. Emmett absorbed this quietly. He had passed the building on his way into town. 3 stories of red brick perched on a rise overlooking Pale Ridge, like a judge looking down on the condemned. Even from a distance, he had felt something about it. Not haunted exactly, but heavy, waiting. Who owns it now? He asked. Bank took it when the last owners couldn't pay taxes. Mr. Finch over at Pale Ridge Savings and Loan. Clara's tone suggested what she thought of Mr. Finch. He'd probably pay you to take it off his hands. The door opened, bringing in bright sunlight and a man in his mid-50s wearing a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. He was built solid, with iron-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Emmett with the careful assessment lawmen develop when they have seen trouble in many forms. Clara, he said in greeting. Then to Emmett, stranger, sheriff. Emmett kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed but respectful. Tom Grady, sheriff of Pale Ridge and the surrounding nothing. He stepped to the counter, and Clara poured him coffee without being asked. Mind if I ask your business here? Just riding through, Emmett said. Thought I might stay a few days if there's no objection. Free country, Grady said, though his eyes said he would be watching. You have a name. Emmett Cain. Something flickered in Grady's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of it. That name sounds familiar. Common enough name, Emmett said evenly, though they both knew better. Grady sipped his coffee, thinking. When he spoke again, his voice was measured. Mr. Cain, I've been sheriff here for 18 years. In that time, I've learned to recognize men who are running from something or running towards something. Which one are you? It was a fair question, and Emmett respected the directness. Both, I suppose. Though I'm too old to be running anymore. More like walking with purpose. This answer seemed to satisfy Grady, or at least did not dissatisfy him. Well, we don't have much trouble here, and I aim to keep it that way. But a man's past is his own business, unless it becomes the town's business. We clear? Clear, Emmett said. Grady finished his coffee and nodded to Clara. As he reached the door, he paused. That hospital you were asking about, Clara, that's town business that's been settled. Best left alone. After the sheriff left, Clara met Emmett's eyes. He's a good man, Tom Grady. Fair. But he remembers what happened at that hospital, same as everyone else here. You'd do well to keep that in mind. Emmett paid for his coffee and stepped back into the afternoon heat. The sun was westering now, throwing long shadows across the empty streets. He walked his horse slowly through town, taking in everything with the attention to detail that had kept him alive through dangerous years. The boarding house was where Clara said it would be, and Mrs. Fletcher, a widow in her 60s with kind eyes and careful hands, agreed to rent him a room for $1 a week, paid in advance. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the hill where the hospital stood. That evening, Emmett sat on the edge of his bed and opened his saddlebag. From the bottom, beneath his spare clothes and ammunition, he drew out a piece of paper folded many times. The creases were worn nearly through, the paper yellowed with age. He unfolded it slowly, knowing what he would see but needing to look anyway. It was a wanted poster, printed 23 years ago. The face staring back at him was his own, younger and harder, with eyes that held no doubt, and a mouth set in a line that suggested violence was always an option. Beneath the drawing, words in bold type, Emmett Cain, wanted dead or alive, reward $500, murder, armed robbery, assault. He had never been caught, never stood trial. The poster existed in that strange space between law and legend, and over the years the heat had faded from it. Lawmen in the territories had bigger problems than aging gunslingers who had gone quiet. But Emmett carried the poster like other men carried photographs of loved ones, as a reminder of who he had been and why he could never go back to being that man. The faces of the dead visited him most nights. They came in dreams sometimes, but more often in the space between waking and sleep. Men he had killed in fair fights and unfair ones, men who had drawn on him and lost, men who had simply been in the wrong place when Emmett's temper or greed or youth had driven him to violence. He remembered them all, names, faces, the particular way each one had fallen. And one boy, always the boy. His name had been Thomas, and he was 7 years old. It was Amarillo 14 years ago. Emmett had been collecting a debt from a man who did not want to pay. Words became heated, heated became drawn weapons, and drawn weapons became gunfire. The man died, as men often did around Emmett Cain, but a stray bullet went through the saloon wall and found the boy in the alley beyond, playing with a stick and a hoop. Emmett learned the child's name later, after he had ridden out of town with the law behind him. He learned it from a newspaper in another territory, where the story ran under the headline, "Innocent Victim of Outlaw Violence." The boy's mother had screamed over his body. Emmett had heard that scream, even as he rode away. He heard it still. That death changed something in him, not all at once, but slowly, like a bone that heals wrong and causes a limp you carry forever. He grew quieter, more careful. The fights came less often, the gun stayed holstered more. He started refusing certain jobs, walking away from certain situations. Men who had known him began to say he was getting soft, getting old, losing his edge. They were right. Emmett folded the wanted poster and returned it to his saddlebag. Through the window, the hospital on the hill was visible in silhouette against the darkening sky. Tomorrow he would go see Mr. Finch at the bank. He had $100 left to his name, everything he owned in the world, and he knew what he wanted to do with it. Some men sought redemption in church. Some found it in the bottle, though that was more forgetting than redeeming. Some tried to find it in the love of a good woman or the honest work of their hands. Emmett Cain, at 62, with nothing to his name but an old horse and an older reputation, thought maybe, just maybe, he could find it in that abandoned hospital on the hill. He did not expect forgiveness. He was too old and too realistic to believe the dead could forgive anything. But perhaps he could build something that balanced the ledger, even if only slightly. Perhaps he could take a place of death and neglect and turn it into a place where people found shelter. It would not erase what he had done. Nothing could do that, but it would be something other than nothing. The next morning, Emmett walked to the Pale Ridge Savings and Loan. It was a narrow building wedged between the empty telegraph office and a lawyer's practice that looked equally abandoned. Inside, the air was close and smelled of paper and dust. A clerk sat at a desk near the door, but Emmett asked for Mr. Finch and was shown to an office in the back. Horace Finch was a small man with nervous hands and a manner that suggested he had been disappointed by life more often than surprised by it. He looked up from his ledgers when Emmett entered, and his expression became carefully neutral. "Mr. Finch, my name is Emmett Cain. I've come to make an offer on the old hospital property." Finch blinked. "The hospital?" He said it as though Emmett had expressed interest in buying the moon. "So that property is, well, it's not exactly in demand. May I ask what you intend to do with it?" "Fix it up. Make use of it." "I see." Finch did not see at all. "That much was obvious. Mr. Cain, that building has been empty for 20 years. The roof leaks, the floors are questionable, and honestly, the history of the place—" "I'll give you $100 for it," Emmett said. "Cash, today!" Finch's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. The bank had been paying taxes on that property for 2 decades, throwing good money after bad. $100 would not recoup their losses, but it would end the bleeding. And more importantly, it would make the hospital someone else's problem. "Mr. Cain," Finch said slowly, "are you certain? The building is sold as is, no warranties, no assurances of any kind." "I'm certain." Emmett drew a small leather pouch from his pocket and counted out bills and coins on Finch's desk. "520s crisp and old. It was literally everything he had. Finch stared at the money, then at Emmett, then back at the money. "Give me an hour to draw up the paperwork." 2 hours later, Emmett stood again on the street, holding a deed written in careful script on legal paper. The hospital, 3 stories and approximately 2 acres of land, now belonged to him. He was, for the first time in his life, a property owner. He was also, for the first time in months, completely broke. The sun was high as he walked up the hill toward his purchase. The road was overgrown, weeds pushing through the packed dirt. The closer he came, the more the building's decay revealed itself. Windows broken or missing entirely. Shutters hanging at angles. The front steps cracked and buckled. The whole structure leaned slightly to the east, as though tired of standing. Emmett stopped at the iron gate, rusted but still standing, and looked up at what he had bought. It was worse than he had thought. It would take months of work just to make it safe, let alone habitable. He had no money, no tools, no help. He was 62 years old and alone, staring up at the monument to his own foolishness. But somewhere inside him, something that had been dormant for years flickered to life. Not hope exactly. Hope was too grand a word. More like possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, this broken place and this broken man might have one more chapter to write. Emmett pushed open the gate. It shrieked on rusted hinges loud in the afternoon quiet. He walked up the path through the weeds, climbed the uncertain steps, and put his hand on the door. The wood was grey with age and weather, but when he pushed, it swung inward. The interior was dark and smelled of rot and animal droppings and time. But as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could make out the bones of what had been. A wide entrance hall, stairs leading up, doorways opening to wards and rooms. The floor was littered with debris, but beneath it, he could see the outline of careful craftsmanship from another era. Emmett Cain stood in the ruined hospital and felt the weight of his wanted poster, still folded in his saddlebag back at the boarding house. He thought of Thomas, the 7-year-old boy in Amarillo. He thought of all the others, the long list of names and faces that haunted his nights. "All right," he said aloud to the empty building, to the ghosts, to himself. "Let's get to work." The first week passed in a blur of assessment and small victories. Emmett spent his days walking through the hospital, room by room, making mental inventories of what could be saved and what was lost beyond recovery. The main floor was the least damaged, structurally sound, if filthy and cluttered with 20 years of accumulated debris. The second floor was questionable, with soft spots in the floorboards where water had leaked through from the roof. The third floor he did not trust at all, not yet. He had no money for materials, so he worked with what he found. Broken furniture became firewood. Intact boards were salvaged and set aside. He collected nails, straightening bent ones with patient work. The labor was hard, and his back complained each morning, but Emmett welcomed the ache. It was the pain of building rather than destroying, and that made all the difference. On the 8th day, he discovered the garden. It was behind the hospital, accessible through what had once been the kitchen. The door was swollen in its frame, and he had to put his shoulder to it before it gave way with a groan. Beyond lay a plot of land perhaps 30 feet square, enclosed by a low stone wall that had partially collapsed in places. What caught his attention was not the tangle of weeds and wild growth, but the small markers scattered throughout, graves. A dozen at least, maybe more hidden beneath the vegetation. Most were simple stones with names and dates worn nearly smooth by weather. But in the center, easily visible despite the overgrowth, stood a cross made of wood. It was crude but carefully crafted, the crossbeam lashed to the upright with what looked like wire. Time and weather had silvered the wood, but it still stood straight. Emmett approached slowly, pushing aside the tall grass. At the base of the cross, carved into the wood with what must have been a pocket knife, were words. Sarah Mills, age 9, gone to Jesus, 1882. He stood there for a long time, looking down at that small grave. The cross would have been made by someone who cared, a parent perhaps, or one of the hospital staff. Someone who wanted to mark this child's passing with something more permanent than memory. The work was rough but heartfelt, the kind of thing a father might make with whatever tools he had at hand, while grief still sat fresh in his chest. Emmett's legs felt suddenly weak. He sank down, sitting on the ground beside the grave, and let the weight of it settle over him. Sarah Mills had been 9 years old when she died, just 2 years older than Thomas had been in Amarillo. She had been sick, brought to this hospital for healing, and instead had found only this plot of earth behind the building. Her parents would have stood where he sat now, watching as the cross was placed, saying whatever words people say when the world makes no sense anymore. The wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like whispered conversation. Emmett found himself talking, though he had not meant to speak aloud. "I killed a boy," he said, to the grave, to the garden, to the empty air. "His name was Thomas. 7 years old. I didn't mean to, but that doesn't matter much, does it? Dead is dead whether you meant it or not." The words kept coming, pulled out of him like poison from a wound. "I've killed a lot of people, and mostly, some of them deserved it, most probably didn't. I told myself it was survival or justice or just the way things were. But Thomas—" His voice caught. Thomas was playing with a stick and a hoop in an alley. He wasn't even supposed to be there. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong world to be born into where men like me exist. A crow called from somewhere in the ruins. Harsh and lonely. Emmett wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I bought this place thinking maybe I could fix it up, live out my days somewhere quiet. But standing here now, looking at your grave, Sarah, I think maybe it needs to be more than that. Should be more than that." He touched the wooden cross, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers. "A place for children who have nowhere else, for people the world's forgotten about. I don't know if I can do it. Don't know if a man like me has any business trying. But I'm going to try anyway." It was not a prayer exactly. Emmett had long since lost whatever faith he might have carried as a child. But it was a promise, and that felt almost as binding. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, and took one last look at the child's grave before heading back toward the hospital. The sun was lowering in the west, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. He needed to get back to work. The boy appeared that evening. Just as the light was failing, Emmett was in what had been the main ward, sweeping accumulated dirt and debris into piles when he sensed movement near the doorway. He turned to find a child watching him from the shadows, small, thin, maybe 10 years old, with dark hair and darker eyes that held too much wariness for someone so young. "Evening," Emmett said quietly, keeping his voice level and unthreatening. He set the broom aside and straightened slowly. "Didn't hear you come in." The boy said nothing, poised like a rabbit, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. His clothes were dirty and too large, cinched at the waist with a piece of rope. His feet were bare despite the cooling evening air. "You hungry?" Emmett asked. "I've got some beans and cornbread from town. Not fancy, but it's warm." Still the boy remained silent, but his eyes flicked toward the corner where Emmett had set up a small camp with his bedroll and supplies. The man could see the hunger in those eyes, the war between caution and desperate need. "My name's Emmett," he said. "What's yours?" After a long pause, the boy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miguel. Miguel." Emmett nodded as though this were a formal introduction at a social gathering. "Well, Miguel, I was just about to have my supper. I'd be grateful for the company if you're willing." He moved slowly toward his supplies, giving Miguel space to decide. From his pack, he retrieved a tin of beans and began heating them over the small fire he had built in what remained of an old stove. The cornbread he unwrapped from cloth and set between them. All the while, he kept his movements calm and predictable, giving the boy time to settle. Eventually, Miguel crept closer. When Emmett offered him a plate of beans and a piece of cornbread, the child took it and ate with the focused intensity of someone who did not know where his next meal might come from. Emmett ate his own portion more slowly, not speaking, letting the silence be comfortable rather than tense. When they had finished, Miguel finally spoke again. "What are you doing here?" "Fixing the place up," Emmett said. "Or trying to. Why?" "Everyone says it's haunted, that people died here. People die everywhere, son. Doesn't make a place haunted. Just makes it sad." Emmett stirred the fire with a stick. I'm thinking about turning it into a place where folks who need somewhere to stay can find shelter. Kids especially. Miguel's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why kids? It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Because kids don't have as many choices as grown folks do. Because the world can be hard, and sometimes children get caught in that hardness through no fault of their own. You got kids? No, Emmett said. Never did, but I should have taken better care of the ones that crossed my path. Miguel thought about this, his thin face serious in the firelight. I've been sleeping in the alley behind the mercantile. Sometimes Mrs. Mendez leaves out scraps. How long since your folks passed? Mama died 6 months ago. Never had a papa that I knew of. Miguel's voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of a child who had learned not to expect sympathy. Been managing on my own since. You've done well to survive this long, Emmett said truthfully. But winter's coming. It's going to get cold. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If you wanted, you could stay here. Help me with the work during the day, earn your keep. There's plenty of room and plenty that needs doing. Miguel looked around the ruined ward, then back at Emmett. What kind of work? Sweeping, hauling, sorting salvage. Nothing too heavy. Honest labor. The boy was quiet for a long time, and Emmett let him be. This was not a decision to be rushed. Finally, Miguel nodded just once, a sharp dip of his chin. I can stay tonight. Tonight and every night after, if you want. They settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. Emmett lay awake for a while, listening to the boy's breathing gradually slow into sleep. Outside, the night sounds of the empty hospital surrounded them, wind through broken windows, the settling of old timbers, the call of an owl somewhere in the darkness. This was how it started then. One broken man and one lost boy, trying to make something out of ruins. It felt both impossibly small and impossibly large, like trying to bail out the ocean with a tin cup while simultaneously building a ship. The next morning, Sheriff Grady appeared at the hospital gate. Emmett was outside examining the foundation stones when he heard the horse approach. Miguel, who had been helping stack salvaged boards, immediately tensed and moved closer to the building. Ready to run, Grady dismounted and tied his horse, then walked up the path with the deliberate pace of a man delivering official business. His face was not hostile, but it was not friendly either. Mr. Cain. Sheriff. Grady's eyes moved to Miguel, who had partially disappeared behind a corner of the building. Picked up a helper, I see. Miguel's staying on to help with the work, Emmett said evenly. He's a good worker. I'm sure he is. Grady removed his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. Mr. Cain, I need to speak plainly. The town is starting to talk about what you're doing up here. Some folks aren't pleased. I bought the property fair and legal. The deed's recorded at the courthouse. I know that. But buying it and turning it into... What exactly are you planning here? The place where people can find shelter when they need it. Nothing more complicated than that. Grady put his hat back on. People in Pale Ridge have long memories. This hospital closed because patients died here, died from neglect and poor care. Families buried loved ones because of what happened in this building. You bringing it back to life, well, it's stirring up old pain. Then maybe it's time that pain got aired out, Emmett said. Seems to me a town that lets a building sit empty for 20 years is a town that's trying to forget something it ought to remember. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he did not disagree. Just be aware, Mr. Cain, not everyone in Pale Ridge is going to welcome what you're doing. And if trouble starts gathering here, vagrants, troublemakers, the kind of people who move from town to town causing problems, I'll shut you down. I don't care what your deed says. Understood, Emmett said. But Sheriff, sometimes people cause problems because nobody's ever given them a reason not to. Maybe they just need a place to rest a while, get themselves sorted out. Grady studied him for a long moment. You know something about that, do you? Needing a place to rest? I know something about it, Emmett said quietly. The sheriff nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Well then, I've said my piece. Keep it quiet, keep it legal, and we won't have problems. But step wrong, and I'll be back. He mounted his horse and rode back down the hill, leaving Emmett and Miguel standing in the morning sun. The boy emerged from his hiding place, his expression troubled. "Is he going to make us leave?" "No," Emmett said. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He looked up at the hospital, at all the work that still needed doing, and felt that flicker of possibility again, a little stronger now. "Come on, son. We've got a lot to do before winter." They went back to work. The work settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Emmett and Miguel rose with the sun and worked until the light failed, breaking only for simple meals and the occasional rest when Emmett's back demanded it. The boy proved quick and capable, learning tasks after a single demonstration and tackling even the dirtiest jobs without complaint. More importantly, he was starting to trust. It showed in small ways. Miguel no longer flinched when Emmett moved suddenly. He spoke more freely, telling stories about his mother, a seamstress who had worked herself into exhaustion, trying to keep them fed after the sickness took her own strength. He asked questions about the work they were doing and about Emmett's past, though the man answered those questions carefully, offering truth without details that might frighten the boy. They cleared the main floor first, hauling out years of accumulated debris, broken furniture, bird nests, the remains of small animals that had found their way inside and never found their way out. They swept and scrubbed until the original floorboards emerged, scarred but solid. Emmett patched the worst holes in the walls with boards salvaged from the upper floors, and Miguel helped seal the gaps with mud and straw mixed into a rough plaster. The main ward began to look almost habitable. Emmett set up a better stove, an old potbelly he found in the basement, rusted but functional, and ran the stovepipe through a window opening until he could properly repair the chimney. With heat and a roof that mostly kept out the rain, they moved their bedrolls inside and claimed the space as theirs. One afternoon, while Miguel was outside gathering firewood, Emmett discovered the logbook. He found it in what had been the hospital administrator's office, a small room off the main entrance hall. The desk had long since rotted beyond use, but beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially protected it from moisture, lay a leather-bound ledger. The cover was water-stained and mildewed, but when Emmett carefully opened it, the pages inside were mostly legible. It was the hospital's admission register, dating from 1878 to 1892. Each entry recorded a patient's name, age, ailment, date of admission, and outcome. Page after page of lives documented in careful script, the handwriting of someone who took their duties seriously, who understood that these names represented real people with real suffering. Emmett sat on the dusty floor and read through the entries, tracing the hospital's history through its patients. Many had recovered and been discharged. Others had died, their final entry marked simply with a cross. He found Sarah Mills, the 9-year-old whose grave he had discovered in the garden, admitted October 12th, 1882, pneumonia, died. October 19th, 1882, burial. In hospital grounds, 7 days she had fought. 7 days someone had tended her, tried to save her, and ultimately failed. The notation was clinical, but Emmett could read the humanity beneath it, the caregiver's grief reduced to ink and paper because there was no other way to bear it. As he continued reading, though, the tone of the entries began to change. Around 1889, a different hand took over the record-keeping. The script was sloppier, entries less detailed. Outcomes became more frequently fatal. By 1891, the admissions had slowed to a trickle, and the final entry, dated March 3rd, 1892, was for a man named Joseph Torres, age 56, admitted with a broken leg. The outcome was left blank. Emmett closed the book carefully and sat with it in his lap. This ledger was the hospital's true history, more honest than any official record. It showed dedication and care in the early years, then a slow decline into neglect as resources failed or priorities shifted or whoever ran the place simply stopped caring enough. The patients had paid the price for that neglect, and the town had never forgotten. He was still sitting there when Miguel returned with an armload of broken branches. The boy dropped the wood by the door and came to investigate, peering over Emmett's shoulder at the ledger. "What's that?" "History," Emmett said. "The hospital's story, written in names and dates." He showed Miguel the entry for Sarah Mills. "Remember the grave we found in the garden? This was her." Miguel studied the page, his lips moving as he sounded out the words. The boy could read somewhat, his mother had taught him, but school had been a luxury they could not afford. "There's a lot of people in there." "There are. Hundreds, probably." Emmett ran his hand over the worn leather cover. "Every one of them came here hoping to get better. Some did, some didn't, but they all mattered, every single one. Is that why you're fixing this place? For them?" It was a perceptive question, more thoughtful than Emmett expected. He considered his answer carefully. "Partly. I can't bring back the people who died here, can't undo the mistakes that were made. But maybe I can honor what this place was supposed to be, a place of healing and shelter." Miguel nodded slowly, accepting this. "Mrs. Mendez came by while you were inside. She left a basket." Emmett stood with a grunt and followed the boy outside. Sure enough, a wicker basket sat on the front steps, covered with a cloth. Inside were supplies: cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, and a small jar of honey. Tucked beneath the food was a note in a woman's neat hand: "For the work you're doing, Clara." It was the first acknowledgement from anyone in town, beyond warnings and suspicion. Emmett felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. He had not been certain whether Pale Ridge would accept what he was trying to do, or whether the town's fear and old grievances would harden into opposition. This basket suggested that at least one person was willing to give him a chance. "That's kind of her," Emmett said, examining the supplies. "Real kind. Can we have the honey?" Miguel asked hopefully. "We can." "Tonight, with some cornbread?" Emmett rewrapped the basket and carried it inside, setting it carefully on the makeshift table he had constructed from salvaged boards. That evening, after they had eaten cornbread sweetened with honey and Miguel had fallen asleep by the stove, Emmett sat with the ledger open again. He read through more entries, familiarizing himself with the names and stories. These were the ghosts of this place, more real than any haunting the townspeople imagined. They deserved to be remembered, to be more than just a source of shame and avoidance. An idea began forming in his mind. When the hospital was ready, if he could get it ready, he would create some kind of memorial. Nothing fancy, just something to acknowledge the lives that had passed through here, both the saved and the lost. A way of saying that their presence had mattered, that the building's failures did not erase its original purpose or the dignity of those who had suffered within its walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards they had not yet secured. Emmett added wood to the stove and pulled his blanket closer. The work ahead was still enormous. The upper floors remained dangerous, the roof needed extensive repairs, and winter was approaching faster than he would have liked. He had no money, few tools, and only a 10-year-old boy for help, but he also had Clara's basket, Miguel's growing trust, and a building that was slowly remembering how to be more than a ruin. He had a ledger full of names that deserved honoring, and a purpose that felt more solid than anything he had carried in years. Emmett Cain closed the hospital register and set it on the table where he could see it. Tomorrow they would start on the roof. Tomorrow they would take another step toward making this place whole. For now, in the warmth of the stove with the boy sleeping peacefully nearby, it was enough to know that the work mattered. It was enough to believe that maybe he still could. The first snow came early that year, dusting the hills around Pale Ridge with white in mid-October. Emmett stood at the hospital's front door and watched it fall, calculating how much time they had before the real cold arrived. Not enough. There was never enough time, but they were making progress. The roof over the main ward was patched well enough to keep out most of the weather. 2 of the ground floor rooms were cleared and cleaned, ready to house people if anyone needed shelter. The stove kept the main space warm, and they had stockpiled enough firewood to last a few weeks at least. Miguel had changed in the month since he had appeared at the hospital. He had filled out a little with regular meals, and his clothes, washed and mended, fit better now. More importantly, his eyes had lost some of their haunted wariness. He laughed occasionally, usually at Emmett's expense when the old man's back seized up or when he fumbled some task that the boy could do more easily. "You're getting old," Miguel would say with the brutal honesty of children. "Been old," Emmett would reply. "Just getting older." The boy was reading better too. In the evenings, by lamplight, Emmett would have Miguel practice with the hospital ledger, sounding out the names and dates. It served double duty, improving the boy's education while ensuring the recorded lives were spoken aloud, remembered, given voice again after years of silence. On a Thursday morning, 10 days after the first snow, they received their second visitor from town. Emmett was working on reinforcing the front steps when he heard the wagon approaching. He straightened, hand instinctively moving toward his hip where his gun rode, old habits, and relaxed when he saw the driver. It was a man in his 60s, thick-built and weathered, with a full beard gone completely white. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and climbed down with the stiffness of someone whose joints argued with him. Every morning. "Emmett Cain?" he called out. "That's right, name's Warren Hayes. I run the carpentry shop in town." He gestured to the wagon bed, which was loaded with tools and lumber. "Heard you were trying to fix this place up with nothing but your bare hands and stubbornness. Figured you could use some proper equipment." Emmett walked down to the gate, Miguel trailing behind him. In the wagon lay a collection that must have represented years of accumulation. Hammers, saws, chisels, planes, level coils of rope, boxes of nails and screws. The lumber was good stock too, milled and ready for use. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate the thought, but I can't pay for any of this." "Did I ask for payment?" Warren's bushy eyebrows rose. "I'm 71 years old, Mr. Cain. My hands shake too much for fine work anymore, and I'm closing the shop come spring. These tools deserve to be used, not sitting in my barn collecting dust. Consider it a loan, if that makes you feel better. You can return them when you're done." It was a fiction, and they both knew it. But it was a kindness wrapped in practicality, the sort of help a proud man could accept without shame. Emmett felt his throat tighten. "That's generous of you," he managed. "Not generous, sensible." Warren glanced up at the hospital. "This building was important once. My own sister died here in '83, pneumonia. The care she got was good, real good. The folks who tended her actually gave a damn. Then things changed, new management came in, and the place went to hell. By the time it closed, it was a disgrace." He looked back at Emmett, his blue eyes sharp and measuring. "I don't know what you're planning here, whether you can pull it off, or if you'll give up come spring. But Clara Mendez seems to think you're sincere, and I trust her judgment. So I figured I'd give you a chance to prove yourself." They spent the next hour unloading the wagon. Warren might have been old, but he was still strong, and he knew his tools. He showed Emmett and Miguel the proper way to use each piece, explained their purposes, pointed out which nails were best for which jobs. It was a master craftsman, passing on knowledge to whoever would listen, making sure his expertise did not die with him. When the wagon was empty, Warren accepted a cup of coffee and surveyed the work they had accomplished so far. He nodded slowly, the gesture of someone who knew quality when he saw it. "You've got a good foundation here. Whoever built this place knew their business. The bones are solid." He pointed to the sagging porch roof. "That needs bracing, and you'll want to replace those support posts entirely. The lumber I brought should be enough." "I don't know how to thank you properly," Emmett said. "Thank me by doing the work right, and by making this place something the town can be proud of again, instead of ashamed of." Warren set down his cup and climbed back onto his wagon. "I'll check in from time to time. Make sure you haven't killed yourself or the boy with improper tool usage." As the wagon rattled back down the hill, Miguel stood beside Emmett, staring at the pile of tools and lumber like it was a treasure chest. "Are people in town starting to like what we're doing?" "Some are, maybe. Or at least they're willing to see what becomes of it." Emmett picked up a hammer from the collection, feeling its weight and balance. It was a fine tool, well made and well maintained, with a hickory handle smoothed by years of use. In the metalwork near the head, Someone had stamped the initials W.H., Warren Hayes, marking his craft. This hammer had built things all over Pale Ridge: houses, shops, furniture, caskets. It had been wielded by skilled hands to create and repair and maintain. Now those hands were too unsteady for fine work, and the hammer needed a new purpose. There was a poetry to that, a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next, from one broken thing to another, still capable of building. "Come on," Emmett said to Miguel. "Let's put these tools to work." They spent the afternoon beginning repairs on the porch. With proper equipment, the work went faster and cleaner. Emmett showed Miguel how to measure twice and cut once, how to check for level and square, how to drive nails with confidence rather than hesitation. The boy learned quickly, his young hands more nimble than Emmett's, though lacking the strength for some tasks. By evening, they had replaced one of the support posts and braced the porch roof. It was not finished, but it was noticeably improved. Stronger, safer, more sound. They stood back and admired their work in the fading light. "Looks good," Miguel said with satisfaction. "It does." Emmett ran his hand along the new post, feeling the solid timber beneath his palm. "Tomorrow we'll do the other post, then start on the steps. Another week, and the entrance will be solid enough to last years." That night, after Miguel had fallen asleep, Emmett sat with Warren's hammer in his hands. He thought about the blacksmith's sister who had died here in 1883, about the good care she had received before the hospital's decline. He thought about all the people those hands had built for, the homes and lives that had been shaped by this tool and the man who wielded it. The hammer was more than equipment. It was a vote of confidence, a bridge between the town's painful past and its possible future. Warren Hayes had brought more than tools. He had brought permission to hope, acknowledgement that what Emmett was attempting mattered to someone beyond himself and an orphaned boy. Emmett set the hammer on the table beside the hospital ledger. Two artifacts now, two pieces of history that connected him to the place he was trying to restore. The ledger told him who had suffered here. The hammer would help him build something better. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Winter was coming fast, but for the first time since arriving in Pale Ridge, Emmett felt they might be ready for it. The old soldier arrived on a cold November morning, leading his horse on foot because he could no longer mount it without help. His name was Benjamin Wolfe, and he was perhaps 50 years old, though hardship and war had aged him beyond his years. His left leg dragged when he walked, the result of a bullet taken at Cold Harbor 30 years prior, and his right hand was missing 2 fingers from the same battle. Miguel saw him first, approaching up the hill, and ran inside to alert Emmett. "There's a man coming. He looks hurt." By the time Emmett reached the front steps, Benjamin had made it to the gate. He stood there, leaning heavily on the fence, breathing hard from the climb. His clothes were threadbare but clean, his face gaunt above a graying beard. But what struck Emmett most were the man's eyes, hollow and distant, looking at things no one else could see. "Help you?" Emmett called out, keeping his voice gentle. Benjamin's focus took a moment to return to the present. "I heard you might have a place for folks with nowhere else. That true?" "It is." "Come on in." They settled Benjamin in one of the cleared rooms off the main ward, a space with a cot that Warren Hayes had included with the tools, a small table, and a window that looked out over the valley. Miguel brought water and food, while Emmett helped the man get situated. Benjamin ate slowly, mechanically, as though hunger was a distant thing he had learned to ignore. When he had finished, Benjamin reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a military medal, the Medal of Honor, its bronze star dulled with age but still recognizable. He set it on the table between them. "Got that at Cold Harbor," Benjamin said, his voice rough from disuse. "They gave it to me for staying at my post when everyone else was dead or running. Stayed because I couldn't walk. Leg was shot to pieces. But they called it courage, pinned this on me at some ceremony I barely remember." Emmett looked at the medal, then at the broken man before him. "That's quite an honor." "Honor?" Benjamin's laugh was bitter. 30 years I've carried this thing. 30 years, trying to figure out why I deserved it. when better men than me died screaming in the mud. You know what I finally decided? What's that? That it doesn't mean anything. Just a piece of metal from people who weren't there, who didn't see what really happened, who needed to make heroes out of survivors because the truth was too ugly to face. He pushed the medal across the table toward Emmett. Keep it, sell it, throw it away. I don't care anymore. I just want to sleep without hearing the guns. Emmett did not touch the medal. This is yours, Mr. Wolf, your story, your burden. I won't take that from you, even if you want me to. Benjamin's eyes finally focused fully on Emmett's face, seeing him clearly for the first time. You got the look of a man who's seen things himself. I have. Killed people. Yes. You sleep at night? Emmett considered the question honestly. Not as well as I'd like, but better than I used to. Benjamin nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he needed to know. He picked up the medal and rewrapped it, tucking it back inside his coat. I'll stay a while if you'll have me. Don't have much to contribute. Body's not good for hard labor anymore. But I can teach the boy to read and write properly, maybe help around in small ways. That's more than enough, Emmett said. Miguel could use the teaching, and I could use another set of eyes on things. They shook hands, Benjamin's grip firm despite the missing fingers. As Emmett stood to leave, the soldier spoke again. Why are you doing this? Men like you, with your past written all over your face. Why spend your last years trying to save people you don't know? Because nobody saved me when I needed it, Emmett said simply. And I'd like to think it's not too late to be different than I was. Over the following days, Benjamin settled into the hospital's rhythm. He moved slowly, but he moved, and that counted for something. True to his word, he began teaching Miguel to read and write with a soldier's discipline, using the hospital ledger as a textbook. The boy thrived under the attention, hungry for knowledge the way he had once been hungry for food. Emmett watched them work together in the evenings, Benjamin's patient voice explaining letters and words, while Miguel practiced writing them on slates Warren had included with his donation. The old soldier had a gift for teaching, breaking complex ideas into simple steps, never showing frustration when Miguel struggled. But the nights were hard for Benjamin. Emmett would wake to the sound of the man's nightmares, shouting sometimes or crying, always the thrashing of someone trying to escape from horrors that would not release them. In the morning, Benjamin would be hollow-eyed and exhausted, the medal clutched in his hand as though it were an anchor rather than an award. One evening, Emmett found him sitting alone in his room, the medal on the table before him, a bottle of whiskey beside it. The bottle was still sealed. Found this in town, Benjamin said without looking up. Been staring at it for 2 hours now? Trying to decide. Emmett sat down across from him. What are you trying to decide? Whether I'm strong enough not to open it. Whether I want to be strong enough. Benjamin touched the bottle with one finger. Spent years drowning in this stuff. Got me through some nights. Destroyed others. Been sober 3 months now, longest stretch since the war. But the dreams keep coming. They will, Emmett said. Some things don't leave us just because we want them to. Then what's the point? If the past is always going to haunt me, why bother staying sober? Why bother with any of it? Emmett was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The point is that tomorrow Miguel needs you to teach him mathematics. The point is that this place needs another good man helping keep it together. The point is that maybe, just maybe, being useful to someone else makes the haunting bearable. Benjamin's hand moved from the bottle to the medal. He held it up to the lamplight, studying it as though seeing it for the first time. You think a man can be redeemed? Actually redeemed, not just distracted from what he's done? I think a man can try. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better today than we were yesterday, and hope tomorrow is better than today. The old soldier nodded slowly. He stood, picked up the sealed bottle and walked to the window. He opened it, letting in the cold November air, and dropped the bottle out into the darkness. They heard it shatter on the rocks below. All right, Benjamin said. All right. I'll try. That night passed quietly. No nightmares, or at least none loud enough to wake the others. In the morning, Benjamin was up early, working with Miguel on his letters before breakfast. The medal sat on the table in his room, unwrapped now, no longer hidden away but not displayed either. Just present, acknowledged. Emmett added Benjamin Wolfe's name to a new ledger he had started, not a record of sickness and death like the old one, but a simple list of people who found shelter at the hospital. One entry for Miguel, one for Benjamin. 2 lives that might have ended badly, now being given another chance. It was a short list still, but it was a start. Word was spreading in town about what was happening on the hill. Some of it was curiosity, some skepticism, some outright hostility. Sheriff Grady stopped by weekly, checking for trouble he never found. Clara sent supplies every few days, more than before, always with brief notes of encouragement. Other townspeople watched from a distance, not helping but not hindering either, waiting to see what would become of Emmett Cain's strange project. Winter was settling in for real now, and the hospital still needed so much work. But it was no longer just a building. It was becoming a place where broken things, broken people, broken dreams, broken faith could be gently held until they remembered how to be whole, or at least how to try. December brought snow that stayed, blanketing Pale Ridge and the surrounding hills in white silence. The hospital, with its patched roof and sealed windows, held warmth better than Emmett had dared hope. They had 3 rooms fully habitable now, a 4th nearly finished, and the main ward served as a common space where Benjamin taught Miguel while Emmett worked on repairs. More people came. An elderly woman named Ruth appeared one frozen afternoon, her belongings in a single carpet bag, her face mapped with the lines of hard decades. She had been living with her daughter's family until her son-in-law decided another mouth to feed was too much burden. Ruth asked for nothing, expected nothing, but accepted the small room they offered with quiet dignity. Within days, she had taken over the cooking, stretching their supplies with the skill of someone who had made miracles from scraps all her life. A week later, 2 younger men arrived, brothers named Jack and Thomas Riley, Irish immigrants whose luck had run out in the silver mines to the north. They had no money and nowhere to go as winter closed in. Emmett put them to work on the upper floors, clearing rooms and shoring up the structure. They worked hard and complained little, grateful for shelter and food. The hospital was becoming what Emmett had envisioned, a place for the discarded and forgotten, those whom the world had no use for, but who still deserved dignity and shelter. It was nowhere near finished, still rough and makeshift, but it was functioning. It was alive. One evening, while going through salvaged items from the upstairs rooms, Emmett found a small wooden box hidden in a bureau drawer. The box was locked, but the wood had warped enough that it opened with little effort. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. He opened the locket carefully. On one side was a photograph of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at whoever held the locket. On the other side was a lock of hair, golden blonde, tied with a thin ribbon. On the back of the locket, engraved in script so small he had to squint to read it, "Sarah, with all my love, Jay." Emmett stared at the photograph for a long time. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but something about her expression, open and hopeful, unguarded in the way of someone who has not yet learned to protect herself from disappointment, struck him deeply. This locket represented love, commitment, the promise of a future that either had or had not been fulfilled. He wondered who Jay had been, and what had happened to Sarah. Had they married, grown old together, died in each other's arms after a lifetime of shared days? Or had something broken between them, leaving this locket hidden in a drawer in an abandoned hospital, forgotten and gathering dust while Sarah grew old somewhere else? Perhaps wondering what became of her gift, Miguel appeared in the doorway. "What did you find?" "Someone's memory." Emmett showed him the locket. "Somebody left this here years ago. Maybe a patient, maybe someone who worked here. It's pretty." Miguel touched the chain gently. "Why would someone leave something so pretty behind?" "Sometimes people leave things behind because it hurts too much to keep carrying them. Sometimes they forget. Sometimes they just stop caring." Emmett closed the locket and set it carefully back in its box. "I'll keep this safe." Maybe whoever it belonged to will come back for it someday. He knew this was unlikely, but the thought mattered. The locket was another piece of the hospital's hidden history. Another story that deserved acknowledgement even if the details were lost to time. That night, gathered around the stove in the main ward, the small community shared a simple meal Ruth had prepared from beans, cornbread and the last of the salt pork. It was not much, but eaten together, with quiet conversation and occasional laughter, it felt like abundance. Benjamin was telling a story, not about the war for once, but about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about catching fireflies in jars on summer evenings, and the way his mother would make ice cream by hand, cranking the freezer on the back porch while children waited in anticipation. Miguel listened with wide eyes, trying to imagine fireflies, a creature he had never seen in this harsh western landscape. The Riley brothers contributed their own stories of growing up in County Cork, the green hills and stone walls, the music and the rain. Ruth spoke little, but smiled at the memories being shared, adding occasional comments that showed she was listening, participating in her own quiet way. Emmett sat slightly apart, listening but not contributing. He had no childhood stories worth sharing, nothing innocent or joyful that did not lead eventually to the darkness that followed. His past was too heavy to bring to this table, to this fragile gathering of people trying to build something new. But watching them, listening to their voices mix with the crackle of the fire, he felt something shift inside him. This was what he had been seeking without knowing it, not redemption exactly, but purpose. The hospital was no longer just a project or a penance. It was becoming a home, not just for these people, but for something larger, an idea perhaps. The notion that broken things could be mended, broken people could find community, and broken places could become sanctuaries. Later, after the others had retired to their rooms, Emmett sat alone with the locket in his hands. He thought about Sarah, whoever she had been, and about all the loves and losses this building had witnessed over the decades. The hospital had seen birth and death, healing and harm, hope and despair. It had held the full spectrum of human experience within its brick walls. Now it was holding something else, the possibility of new beginnings, of lives salvaged from the margins and given another chance. Miguel was learning to read and write. Benjamin had not touched alcohol in months. Ruth had a place of belonging instead of being an unwanted burden. The Riley brothers had work and warmth instead of freezing to death in some mining camp. These were small victories, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of things. But Emmett had learned through hard years that small victories were the only kind that mattered. The grand gestures, the dramatic redemptions, those were for stories and legends. Real life was built from small choices, day after day, to be slightly better than you had been before. He set the locket on the shelf beside Warren's hammer and the hospital ledger. 3 artifacts now, each telling part of a larger story. The ledger documented pain and loss. The hammer represented the possibility of building something new. The locket held love and mystery, a reminder that every life contained depths that could not be fully known or understood. Outside, snow fell softly in the darkness, adding to the drifts that surrounded the hospital. Inside, the stove's warmth held back the cold, and 6 people slept under the same roof, safe for at least another night. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. But Emmett knew, with the instinct of a man who had lived too long in the presence of violence, that this peace was temporary. Something was coming. He could feel it in the way the townspeople's glances had shifted from skeptical to calculating, in the way Sheriff Grady's visits had become more frequent, in the tension that had started building around the edges of their small haven. The hospital was attracting attention, becoming known not just in Pale Ridge, but in the surrounding territories. And not all attention was welcome. There were people in this world who could not stand to see others finding peace, who saw vulnerability as opportunity and kindness as weakness to be exploited. Emmett checked his revolver before turning in, making sure it was clean and loaded. He hoped he would never need it again. But hope and preparation were not the same thing, and the man he had been before, the gunfighter, the killer, was not entirely gone. Just sleeping, waiting to be called upon if necessary. He prayed it would not be necessary. But prayers, he had learned, were not always answered the way you wanted. She arrived on a Tuesday in mid-December, riding in a hired wagon with a driver from the next town over. Emmett was outside chopping wood when he saw the wagon laboring up the hill through the snow. He set down his axe and watched it approach, a familiar cold settling in his stomach. Strangers arriving in wagons usually meant trouble of one kind or another. The woman who stepped down from the wagon was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in a traveling coat of good quality, but worn with use. Her hair was silver, pulled back in a bun beneath a simple hat. She moved carefully, leaning on a walking stick, and when she looked up at the hospital, her face showed a complex mixture of emotions Emmett could not immediately read. She dismissed the driver with payment and turned to face Emmett fully. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, and in that moment recognition struck him like a physical blow. He knew her face, not as it was now, but as it had been 30 years ago. Younger, framed by dark hair instead of silver, filled with life and laughter before he destroyed it. Her name rose from the depths of memory, like a drowning man coming up for air. "Grace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hello, Emmett." Her voice was steady, controlled, giving nothing away. "I heard you were here, heard what you were doing. I had to see for myself, Grace Brennan." The name came with a flood of memories he had spent decades trying to bury. Kansas City, 1870. He had been 28 years old and already deep into the life that would eventually consume him. Grace had been a clerk in a land office, 26 and unmarried, living with her widowed mother. They had met by chance, spoken a few times, and something unexpected had sparked between them. For 3 months, Emmett had courted her properly, acting like the respectable man he had never been. He told her he was a cattle buyer, traveling the territories on business. She believed him because she wanted to, because she saw in him something worth saving, even if she did not know from what. They spoke of marriage, of a future, of children and a home, and all the things Emmett had never let himself want. Then came the robbery. Emmett and 2 partners had planned to hit a bank, supposed to be simple, clean, in and out. But nothing ever went clean. The manager resisted, drew a weapon, and in the gunfire that followed, one of Emmett's bullets went through the wall into the office beyond. Into the land office where Grace was working late, preparing documents for the next day's sales. The bullet struck her mother. Grace's mother, who had come to walk her daughter home, because the hour was late and the streets were not safe. The woman died in Grace's arms, while Emmett fled through the back streets, not knowing until later what he had done. By the time he learned, it was too late. Grace had identified him to the authorities. His wanted poster was printed. The man she thought she knew was revealed as the killer he actually was. And Grace was left to bury her mother and carry the burden of having loved the man responsible. Emmett had run, changed territories, and spent the next 30 years trying to forget. But you never truly forgot something like that. Grace's face had appeared in his nightmares alongside all the others, but hers was different. The others had been accidents or necessities, depending on how he justified them. Grace had been something else entirely, someone he had lied to, betrayed, and destroyed through his own selfishness and greed. Now she stood before him, 30 years later. Leaning on a walking stick because of injuries from that night, she had been hurt too, he remembered now. Struck by falling debris when the bank wall exploded outward. Emmett started, then stopped. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" was too small for what he had done. "I didn't mean to" was true, but irrelevant. The dead were still dead. "I know why you're here," Grace said, her voice cutting through his paralysis. "Not why you're in Pale Ridge specifically, but why you're doing this." She gestured at the hospital. "You're trying to balance the ledger. Build something good to offset all the bad. Am I right?" Emmett nodded, not trusting his voice. "I spent 30 years hating you," Grace continued. 30 years wishing you dead. hoping every report of an outlaw killed would turn out to be you. I carried that hate like a religion, tended it like a flame, because it was the only thing that gave me purpose after Mother died." She reached into her coat and withdrew a photograph, yellowed with age. She held it out to him, and he took it with shaking hands. The image showed a younger Grace, standing beside an older woman. Her mother, obviously, the resemblance clear in their faces. They were smiling, arms linked, taken at some fair or celebration. It was dated on the back, Kansas City, May 1870. "That was 3 weeks before you killed her," Grace said. "I've carried that photograph every day since. Looked at it every night before I went to sleep, so I would never forget what you took from me." Emmett stared at the photograph, at the happiness frozen in that moment before he had shattered it. "Why are you here?" he managed to ask.
"Why now?"
"Because I'm dying," Grace said simply. "The doctors give me maybe 6 months, probably less. Cancer spreading from my lungs. And I realized I didn't want to die still carrying all that hate. It's too heavy, and I'm too tired." She took the photograph back from him, holding it carefully. "I came here to see if what I heard was true, that Emmett Cain, the man who murdered my mother, was trying to build a place for people with nowhere else to go. I came to see if redemption was actually possible, or if it was just another lie." "I don't know if it is," Emmett said honestly. "I don't know if anything I do will ever balance what I've done. But I have to try." "Why?" "Because I can't live with myself if I don't." Grace studied him for a long moment. Then, to his complete shock, she nodded toward the hospital. "Show me." He took her through the building, showing her the cleaned rooms, the repaired roof, the stove that kept everyone warm. He introduced her to Miguel, Benjamin, Ruth, and the Riley brothers, the small community that had formed in this unlikely place. Grace watched everything carefully, asked questions, listened to their stories. When the tour was complete, they stood in the main ward while the others went about their evening tasks. Grace lowered herself carefully onto a bench, her breathing labored from the exertion. "You've done something here," she said finally. "Something real. These people, they have hope because of what you built. It doesn't change what I did to you, to your mother. No, it doesn't." Grace looked at him directly, her eyes holding his. "Nothing can change that. My mother is still dead. Those 30 years of grief are still real. But Emmett, holding on to hate hasn't brought her back. It hasn't made anything better. It's just made me bitter and alone." She reached into her other pocket and withdrew an envelope sealed with wax. "I wrote this letter 5 years ago, when I first heard rumors that you were still alive. It contains everything I wanted to say to you, all the anger, all the pain, all the accusations. I carried it with me for years, waiting for the day I would find you and force you to read it, force you to sit with what you'd done." Grace held the envelope over the lamp beside the bench. The wax seal caught fire, and she let the flames consume the paper, dropping it into a metal bucket when it became too hot to hold. They watched it burn together, the words she had written turning to ash. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly. "I don't know if I ever can. But I don't want to hate you anymore. And I don't want to die still angry at a man who's trying to do better." "What do you want then?" Emmett asked. Grace looked around the ward, at the people who had found shelter here, at the building that was becoming something more than its broken past. "I want to stay," she said. "However long I have left, I want to spend it here, helping with whatever I can do. Teaching these people to read if they can't, sewing if you need it, cooking if Ruth will let me help. I want to be part of something good before I die." "Grace, I'm not doing it for you," she interrupted. "I'm doing it for me, and for my mother, who would have wanted me to let go of the hate. She was a kind woman, my mother. She believed in second chances, even though you never gave her one." Emmett felt tears on his face and did not wipe them away. "I don't deserve this. No, you don't. But these people here do. They deserve every bit of help they can get. And I have a little bit left to give." She stood slowly, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "Now show me where I can sleep. It's been a long journey, and I'm tired." He gave her the best room they had, cleaned and warm, with a real bed that Warren Hayes had donated just the week before. After she was settled, Emmett walked outside into the cold December night and stood in the snow. looking up at stars that offered no answers. Grace Brennan, the woman whose life he had destroyed, had come not seeking vengeance, but seeking peace. She had brought with her a photograph of her murdered mother and a burned letter full of hate transformed into ash. She was dying, and she wanted to spend her final months in the place he had built from his guilt and grief. The irony was almost too much to bear. But beneath the irony was something else, a strange, terrible gift. Grace had shown him that forgiveness was not always necessary for healing to begin. That two people carrying unbearable burdens could exist in the same space without destroying each other. That redemption, if it existed at all, was not about earning forgiveness, but about choosing to be different than you had been. Inside the hospital, lights glowed from the windows. 6 people now, soon to be 7, all of them broken in different ways, all of them trying to put their pieces back together. And Grace, bringing her own brokenness to add to the collection, choosing to spend her final days building instead of destroying. Emmett looked down at his hands, scarred, weathered, hands that had killed and hurt and taken so much. But they were also the hands that had repaired this building, that had offered shelter, that had chopped wood to keep people warm through the winter. They were still his hands. He was still Emmett Cain, still guilty of everything he had done. But maybe, just maybe, he was also becoming something else. Something better. Not redeemed, he would never claim that. But trying, always trying. Winter deepened, and with it came trouble. It started with small things. Supplies left at the gate went missing before Emmett could collect them. Anonymous notes appeared, crude and threatening, warning that the hospital was not welcome, that Emmett should take his collection of failures and leave Pale Ridge. Someone threw rocks through 2 of the newly repaired windows. The incidents were never witnessed, never caught, but the message was clear enough. Sheriff Grady came more frequently now, his expression grim. "There's talk in town," he said one evening, standing in the hospital's entrance hall. "Some folks think you're attracting the wrong element, that this place is going to bring trouble down on Pale Ridge." "What kind of trouble?" Emmett asked. "The vague kind. The kind that justifies fear without needing facts to back it up." Grady looked around at the hospital's interior, at the improvements that had been made. "Truth is, Mr. Cain, you're making some people uncomfortable. They see these folks you're helping, and it reminds them of their own failures. Reminds them of family they turned away, neighbors they ignored. Guilt makes people mean. So what do I do?" "Keep doing what you're doing, but be ready for things to get worse before they get better." Grady's hand rested on his gun belt, a gesture of habit rather than threat. "And for what it's worth, I think what you're building here matters. Not everyone agrees with me, but I speak for the law. Long as you're not breaking it, I'll do my best to keep you safe." The sheriff left, and Emmett stood in the doorway watching the sun set over Pale Ridge. The town spread below like an accusation, its lights beginning to wink on as evening fell. Somewhere down there, people were gathering, talking, deciding what to do about the problem on the hill. Grace found him there, moving slowly with her walking stick. The weeks since her arrival had not been kind to her. She was thinner now, her breathing more labored, the cancer doing its slow work. But her eyes were sharp and her mind clear. "They're going to come for us," she said. It was not a question. Maybe. What will you do when they do? Emmett considered this. The old him would have prepared for war, would have positioned weapons and planned ambushes and been ready to kill anyone who threatened what he had built. The man he was trying to become wanted to find another way, wanted to believe that reason and patience could prevail over fear and anger. "I'll try to talk to them first," he said. "Make them understand we're not a threat, that what we're doing here helps everyone. And if talking doesn't work..." He did not answer. They both knew the truth, that violence was always waiting at the edges of civilized behavior, that men who carried guns for years never quite forgot how to use them, that sometimes the world forced you to choose between what you wanted to be and what you needed to survive. That night, another note appeared, this one different from the others. It was nailed to the hospital's front door, and the paper was of better quality, the handwriting more educated. Emmett took it down and read it by lamplight while the others gathered around. To the proprietor of the so-called hospital, you are hereby notified that a meeting of concerned citizens will be held 3 days hence at the Pale Ridge Community Hall to address the matter of your establishment and its impact on our town. Your presence is requested at 7 o'clock in the evening. Be prepared to explain yourself and your intentions. Failure to appear will be taken as admission that you have something to hide. Signed, the Committee for Community Standards. Benjamin looked over Emmett's shoulder at the notice. That's a trap. They'll outnumber you, shout you down, maybe worse. Maybe, Emmett said. But if I don't go, they'll take that as weakness. Might even give them the excuse they need to come up here and shut us down by force. So you'll go? I'll go, but not alone. Emmett looked around at the small group. Miguel, Benjamin, Ruth, the Riley brothers, Grace. If you're willing, I'd like you all to come with me. Show them the faces of the people they're so afraid of. Let them see you're just human beings trying to get by. Grace spoke up, her voice steady despite her physical frailty. They won't see us as human beings. They'll see us as problems they want solved. But yes, I'll come. We all should. The others nodded agreement, and something in Emmett's chest loosened slightly. He was not alone in this. Whatever happened at that meeting, whatever came after, he had people standing beside him. It was more than he deserved and exactly what he needed. The next 3 days were spent preparing, though not in the way Emmett might have prepared in his younger years. Instead of weapons and strategies for violence, they prepared testimonies. Each person wrote out their story, where they had come from, what had brought them to the hospital, how their lives had changed since arriving. Benjamin helped Miguel with his writing. Ruth practiced reading her testimony aloud, her voice gaining strength with repetition. The Riley brothers polished their English, making sure they would be understood. Grace wrote nothing. I'll speak from the heart, she said. What I have to say can't be rehearsed. On the morning of the meeting, Clara Mendez arrived with a basket and an unexpected announcement. I'm coming with you tonight, she said. Warren Hayes, too. We're not standing by while they try to shut you down, Clara. You don't have to. Don't tell me what I have to do. Emmett Cain. This town turned its back on people when they needed help, and you stepped in when nobody else would. That matters to some of us. We're not all afraid of doing the right thing, so their group grew. 9 people now, preparing to face a town that had decided they were a problem rather than a solution. That evening, they walked down the hill together as the sun set. Miguel stayed close to Emmett, nervous but determined. Benjamin moved with military precision, as though marching to battle. Ruth and Grace supported each other, both moving slowly but steadily. The Riley brothers flanked them all, their size and bearing a quiet reminder that they would protect the group if needed. The community hall was packed when they arrived. Every seat was filled, and more people stood along the walls. The air was thick with tension and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. At the front of the room, a table had been set up with 5 men seated behind it. Town leaders, business owners, men who had appointed themselves judges of what was acceptable in Pale Ridge. The central figure was a man Emmett recognized from town, Carter Boone, who owned the largest ranch in the territory and wielded influence accordingly. He was in his 50s, prosperous and proud, the kind of man who believed success gave him the right to dictate terms to everyone else. Mr. Cain, Boone said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. We appreciate you accepting our invitation. Please come forward so everyone can hear what you have to say. Emmett walked to the front, aware of every eye on him. He positioned himself facing the crowd rather than the table, making it clear he was addressing the people, not just the committee. My name is Emmett Cain, he began, his voice steady and clear. Some of you know me. Most of you don't. What you do know is that I bought the old hospital on the hill and have been trying to restore it. What you might not know is why. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'm 62 years old. I've lived a hard life, made a lot of mistakes, hurt people I shouldn't have hurt. I came to Pale Ridge looking for a place to rest, maybe to die quietly without causing any more harm. But when I saw that hospital abandoned, rotting, forgotten, I saw something else. I saw a chance to build something instead of destroy something, to help instead of hurt." "That's a fine speech," Boone interrupted. "But what we're concerned about is the kind of people you're collecting up there. Vagrants, drifters, people with no ties to our community. How do we know they're not criminals? How do we know they won't bring trouble to Pale Ridge?" Before Emmett could answer, Grace stepped forward. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on her walking stick, and the room quieted as people registered her age and obvious illness. "My name is Grace Brennan," she said, her voice thin but clear. 30 years ago, this man," she pointed at Emmett, "killed my mother during a bank robbery in Kansas City. Shot her by accident while he was stealing money he had no right to. I spent 3 decades hating him, wishing him dead, carrying that hate like a sacred burden." The room erupted in murmurs. Boone leaned forward, sensing advantage. "And yet you're here defending him?" "Madam, forgive me, but that makes no sense, doesn't it?" Grace turned to face the crowd fully. "I'm dying. Cancer, 6 months if I'm lucky. I came to that hospital looking for closure, maybe for revenge. What I found instead was a place where broken people were being given dignity and shelter, where a man who destroyed my life was spending his last years trying to build something good for others." She paused for breath, and the room waited. "I don't forgive him. I may never forgive him, but I've stopped hating him, because hate was killing me just as surely as this cancer. And I've chosen to spend my final days in that hospital because it's a place of healing, not just for bodies, but for souls." The silence that followed was profound. Grace had given them truth without decoration, had stripped away all pretense, and shown them the raw reality of what the hospital represented. Not salvation, not redemption, but the possibility of being better than your worst moments. Miguel spoke next, his young voice uncertain but earnest. Benjamin followed, then Ruth, then the Riley brothers. Each person told their story, where they had come from, how they had ended up at the hospital, what it meant to have shelter and community when the world had given up on them. When they had finished, Emmett addressed the crowd again. "You want to know if we're criminals? Some of us have pasts we're not proud of. You want to know if we're a threat? The only threat we pose is to your comfort, the comfort of pretending people like us don't exist. That poverty and hardship and bad luck are problems that happen somewhere else to someone else." He let that sink in, then continued. "The hospital isn't perfect. We're making do with scraps and determination, but it's real, and it's helping real people. If you shut us down, these folks have nowhere to go. They'll freeze in alleys, or starve on the road, or disappear into whatever darkness takes people when society decides they don't matter. Is that what Pale Ridge wants to be? A town that turns its back on the vulnerable?" Carter Boone stood, his face red. "You're twisting this, Cain. We're not heartless. We're protecting our community from what?" Clara Mendez's voice cut through the room like a knife. She stood from where she had been sitting in the back. "Protect us from what, Carter? From people who need help? From the reminder that any of us could end up in their situation with just a little bad luck." Warren Hayes stood beside her. "I lost my sister in that hospital 40 years ago, but she got good care before the place went bad. What Emmett's doing, he's bringing back what that building was supposed to be. He's giving it another chance. Seems to me we could do the same for these people." The room dissolved into argument, some supporting Emmett, others defending Boone, most uncertain and swayed by whoever spoke last. It went on for an hour, voices rising and falling, accusations and defenses, fear and compassion battling for dominance. Finally, Sheriff Grady stood and fired his pistol into the ceiling. The crack of gunfire silenced everyone instantly. "Enough," he said. "Here's what's going to happen. The hospital stays open. Emmett Cain bought that property legally, and he's doing nothing against the law. If anyone has a specific complaint, theft, assault, actual crime, bring it to me and I'll investigate. But vague fears and discomfort don't justify shutting down a place that's helping people. Sheriff, you're overstepping." Boone began. "No, Carter, you're overstepping. You don't get to run people out of town just because you don't like them." Grady holstered his weapon. "Meeting's over. Everyone go home. The crowd dispersed slowly, grumbling and arguing among themselves. Some people approached Emmett with words of support. Others glared as they left, making clear that this was not finished. As they walked back up the hill through the darkness, Miguel took Emmett's hand, a gesture of trust and affection that the boy had never made before. On his other side, Grace moved slowly, supported by Benjamin and Ruth. "That went better than I expected," Benjamin said. "Or worse," Emmett replied. "We've made our position clear, and so have they. Now we wait to see what happens next." What happened next would test everything they had built, everything they believed about redemption and second chances. But for tonight, walking up the hill together under the winter stars, they were still standing. Still together, still trying. The fire started just after midnight, 3 days after the town meeting. Emmett woke to the smell of smoke and Miguel's terrified shaking. He was on his feet instantly, old instincts taking over. Smoke poured under the door of their room, and when he touched the wood, it was already warm. "Everyone up!" he shouted, moving through the building and pounding on doors. "Fire, get out now!" The hospital came alive with panicked voices. Benjamin emerged from his room, helping Ruth, who was coughing from the smoke. The Riley brothers appeared, moving quickly to assist Grace, who could not move fast. Miguel stayed close to Emmett, his eyes wide with fear. The main ward was already burning. Someone had piled kindling and doused it with lamp oil. This was no accident. Flames licked up the walls Emmett had spent months repairing, consuming the wood and plaster like hungry beasts. The heat was intense, pushing them back even as they tried to reach the front door. "The back way!" Emmett shouted. "Through the kitchen!" They fled through the smoke, Emmett counting heads to make sure everyone was accounted for. 7 people: Miguel, Benjamin, Ruth, Grace, Jack, and Thomas Riley himself. They burst through the back door into the cold December night, coughing and gasping, and watched as flames consumed the building they had worked so hard to restore. The fire burned hot and fast, fed by dry timber and malicious intent. Within minutes, the main floor was fully engulfed. Emmett stood there helpless, watching months of work disappear into smoke and ash. Everything they had built, everything they had created together, was burning. Grace stood beside him, her breathing ragged from more than just smoke. "They did this," she said quietly. "Someone from town decided we were too much trouble." "It doesn't matter who," Emmett said, though fury burned in his chest hotter than any fire. "What matters is everyone got out. We're alive, but the hospital is just a building. We're not." He looked at the faces around him, lit by the orange glow of the flames. Frightened but alive, together. "Buildings can be rebuilt." Miguel tugged on his sleeve. "Emmett, look." Following the boy's pointing finger, Emmett saw figures emerging from the darkness. For a moment, panic seized him. Had the arsonists come back to finish what they started? But as the figures drew closer, he recognized faces from town. Clara Mendez with buckets, Warren Hayes with more people behind him, Sheriff Grady with a wagon full of water barrels. "We saw the glow," Clara called out. "The whole town can see it. We came to help." They formed a bucket brigade, pulling water from the hospital's well and throwing it on the flames. It was too late to save the main structure, but they worked to keep the fire from spreading to the undamaged wings. More people arrived. Some Emmett recognized from the town meeting, others he had never seen before. They worked together through the night, passing buckets, beating back flames with wet blankets, saving what could be saved. By dawn, the fire was out. The main ward was a blackened ruin, roof collapsed, walls charred and unstable. But the east wing still stood, damaged by smoke but structurally sound. And standing around the wreckage were nearly 30 people from Pale Ridge, exhausted and soot-covered, having worked through the night to fight the fire. Carter Boone was not among them. Neither were his closest associates. But plenty of others were: shopkeepers, farmers, families with children who had watched from a safe distance. People who had decided, in the moment of crisis, which side of the line they stood on. Sheriff Grady approached Emmett, his face grim. "This was arson. No question. I'll investigate, find who did it, and they'll hang for it. It won't bring back what we lost," Emmett said quietly. "No, but it'll send a message that Pale Ridge won't tolerate this kind of behavior." Grady looked at the gathered crowd. These people, they came to help you, Emmett. That means something. It did mean something. It meant that the battle Emmett had been fighting was not entirely lost, that some part of Pale Ridge understood what the hospital represented. Not everyone agreed with him, but enough did. Enough to make a difference. As the sun rose over the smoking ruins, Clara brought them coffee and blankets. Warren organized the men to start assessing structural damage and planning repairs. Women from town offered to take the refugees into their homes temporarily. Ruth with one family, the Riley brothers with another. Everyone would have shelter while they rebuilt. Grace, too weak to have helped with the firefighting, sat on a salvaged bench and looked at the destruction with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of despair, Emmett realized, but something else. Something like hope mixed with grief. He sat beside her, both of them wrapped in borrowed blankets, watching the town come together around the ashes of what they had built. The hospital's sign, the one Warren had carved and Emmett had mounted just weeks ago, lay in the rubble, charred but still readable. Pale Ridge Hospital and Refuge. All welcome. We'll rebuild, Emmett said. Yes, Grace agreed. We will. The rebuilding started the next morning. What Emmett expected to do alone, or perhaps with his small group of refugees, instead became a community effort. People from Pale Ridge arrived at the hospital with tools, lumber, supplies, and willing hands. They came not because they had to, but because the fire had shown them something important, that the hospital mattered, that what Emmett had been building was worth saving. Warren Hayes took charge of the construction, his carpenter's eye assessing what could be salvaged and what needed complete replacement. The East Wing became the focus. The structure was sound enough to serve as the core of a rebuilt hospital. The main ward would take longer, but with enough hands, it could be done before spring. Emmett worked alongside everyone else, no longer the solitary figure struggling against impossible odds. Men he had never spoken to worked beside him, measuring and cutting and hammering. Women brought food and coffee, organized supplies, tended to Grace, whose health was declining rapidly from the stress and smoke inhalation. On the third day of rebuilding, Sheriff Grady arrived with news. He had arrested 2 men for arson, ranch hands who worked for Carter Boone. They had confessed under questioning, claiming Boone had paid them to scare off the troublemakers, but insisting they had only meant to cause minor damage. Not the inferno that had nearly killed everyone. Boone's denying everything, of course, Grady said. But his men are talking, and I have enough evidence to charge him. He'll stand trial. And in the meantime, Emmett asked, in the meantime he's finished in this town. People know what he did, or at least what he paid to have done. His influence is gone. Grady looked around at the bustling reconstruction. Looks like you won, Cain. Not the way you might have wanted, but you won. Emmett was not sure what winning looked like anymore. The hospital was damaged, Grace was dying, and people had nearly been killed. But the town had rallied. The community had chosen mercy over fear. That had to count for something. That evening, as the workers headed back to town, Emmett found Miguel standing before the charred remains of the main ward. The boy held something carefully in his hands, the hospital ledger, water-damaged and smoke-stained but mostly intact. He had gone into the ruins to search for it, risking the unstable structure to save this record of names and stories. I thought we should keep this, Miguel said, handing it to Emmett. So we remember everyone who was here before us. Emmett took the ledger, feeling its weight. The pages were warped, some entries smudged beyond reading, but most remained legible. The history of the hospital, preserved through fire and water, ready to continue its record. Thank you, he said to Miguel. This matters. You did a brave thing. You taught me to be brave, the boy replied simply. You and Benjamin and everyone else. Before I came here, I was just trying to survive. Now I'm learning to live. That night, they held a gathering in the East Wing, the only space large enough and safe enough for everyone. The refugees and the townspeople sat together, sharing a meal that families from Pale Ridge had prepared. It was humble food, but there was enough for everyone, and it was shared freely. Grace spoke, her voice weak but determined. I came here expecting to spend my last days in bitterness and regret. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. A community that values mercy over judgment, that understands we're all broken in our own ways. She looked at Emmett. I still carry the pain of what you did. I always will. But I have also seen you become someone different. Someone who builds instead of destroys. You can't undo the past. None of us can. But we can choose what we do with our todays and tomorrows. Clara Mendez stood next. This hospital represents something Pale Ridge needs to remember, that we're strongest when we help each other, not when we push each other away. The fire tried to destroy what Emmett built, but instead it showed us what really matters. One by one, people spoke. Some apologized for their earlier opposition. Others shared stories of their own struggles, times when they had needed help and either received it or did not. The gathering became a confession and celebration combined, a recognition that every person there carried both light and darkness. That judgment was easy, but mercy was hard and necessary. When everyone had spoken who wanted to, Emmett stood. He was not good with speeches, never had been, but these people deserved to hear what was in his heart. I've spent my whole life running from what I was, a killer, a thief, a man who took more than he gave. Coming here, starting this hospital, it was supposed to be about making up for that somehow. But what I've learned is that redemption doesn't work that way. You can't balance a ledger of souls. The dead stay dead, and the hurt stays hurt. He paused, looking at the faces around him. But you can choose to be different going forward. You can build something good, even if you've destroyed things in the past. And you don't have to do it alone. Every person in this room has helped make this place what it is. Not just a building, but a community. You've shown me that mercy is stronger than fear, that people can change, that it's never too late to try. The silence that followed was not awkward but full, pregnant with understanding and shared purpose. They had been through fire together, literally and figuratively, and they had survived. More than survived. They had become something stronger. As people began to drift away, heading home or to temporary lodging, Emmett stood with the hospital ledger in his hands. Tomorrow he would add new names to it, not just the refugees who had found shelter, but the townspeople who had fought the fire, the workers who were rebuilding, everyone who had chosen to be part of this unlikely redemption. The hospital was rising from its ashes better than before. And so, perhaps, was he. Spring came early to Pale Ridge that year, melting the snow and revealing the green beneath. The hospital stood complete again, not exactly as it had been, but better. The east wing was fully restored, the main ward rebuilt with stronger timber and better craftsmanship than the original. New windows let in light that had been blocked for decades. The roof was solid, the floors level, the walls painted white. Grace Brennan died on a warm April morning, surrounded by people who had become her family in the final months of her life. She passed peacefully in her sleep, the silver locket with her mother's photograph clutched in her hand. They buried her in the hospital garden, next to the small grave marked by Sarah Mills's wooden cross. Emmett carved Grace's marker himself, taking his time to get the words right. Grace Brennan, 1844-1896, she chose mercy over hate. The funeral drew half the town. People who had opposed the hospital, people who had supported it, people who had watched from the sidelines. They all came to pay respects to a woman who had traveled across territories to find peace in the last place anyone expected. Clara Mendez sang a hymn in a voice clear and pure. Benjamin read from Scripture, though he was not a religious man, because the words felt right. Miguel placed wildflowers on the fresh grave, tears streaming down his face for the woman who had shown him that forgiveness was complicated but possible. After the funeral, Emmett stood alone in the garden as evening fell. He thought about Grace, about her mother, about all the lives that had intersected with his own across the decades. The weight of his past had not disappeared, it never would. But it felt different now, less like a crushing burden and more like a foundation upon which he had built something worth building. The hospital was thriving. 23 people now called it home. Some temporary residents passing through rough patches, others permanent like Benjamin and Ruth, who had found purpose in helping run the place. Miguel was enrolled in the town school, excelling at his studies under Benjamin's tutoring. The Riley brothers had found steady work in town, but returned to the hospital most evenings, unable to quite let go of the community that had saved them. Warren Hayes had donated the last of his tools to the hospital's workshop, where they taught carpentry to anyone interested in learning a trade. Clara organized donations from town, ensuring they always had food and supplies. Sheriff Grady stopped by weekly, no longer checking for trouble, but simply visiting friends. Even Carter Boone's trial had ended as well as could be expected. He was found guilty of conspiracy to commit arson and sentenced to prison. His ranch was sold to pay restitution, and the hospital received enough money to establish a small endowment. Not much, but enough to keep them going through hard times. One evening in late May, Emmett sat on the front porch of the hospital with Miguel beside him. The boy was reading aloud from a book Warren had given him, a collection of stories about the West, some true and some embellished beyond recognition. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. "Emmett?" Miguel asked, closing the book. "Do you think about your past much anymore?" It was a child's question, direct and without guile. Emmett considered it carefully. "Every day, but it doesn't haunt me the same way it used to. Because you built this place. Because I found people worth building it for. You, Benjamin, Ruth, Grace. All of you taught me that redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. It's about choosing what you do next." Miguel thought about this, his young face serious in the fading light. "When I grow up, I want to help people like you helped me. Maybe I'll be a doctor, work in a hospital." "You'd be a fine doctor," Emmett said, and meant it. "Whatever you become, you'll do it well. You've got a good heart, son." The word son slipped out naturally, and Miguel beamed at it. They had never formally discussed their relationship, but somewhere along the way, Emmett had become more than a benefactor, and Miguel more than a ward. They were family now, bound not by blood but by choice and shared struggles. Inside the hospital, lights were being lit against the gathering darkness. Through the windows, Emmett could see Benjamin helping a new arrival settle into a room. Ruth was in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. The Riley brothers were playing cards with some of the other residents, their laughter carrying out into the twilight. This was what he had built. Not just walls and roofs and repaired floors, but a community, a place where broken people could find shelter and dignity, a place where the past did not define you, where tomorrow mattered more than yesterday, where mercy was extended freely because everyone understood that they might need it themselves someday. On the table beside Emmett sat the hospital ledger, open to the most recent entries. The old names were still there: Sarah Mills, Grace's mother, whose name he had added from memory, Benjamin Wolfe, Ruth, the Riley brothers, Grace herself. But now there were new names too, a growing list of people who had passed through or stayed, each one representing a life touched, a chance given, hope extended. Beside the ledger lay the $100 bill, the last of his money that he had used to buy this place so many months ago. The banker had returned it as a gift after Boone's restitution came through, a symbolic gesture recognizing Emmett's transformation. It was framed now, mounted on the wall inside the hospital's entrance hall with a small plaque, "The seed that grew into shelter." Emmett Cain was 63 years old. He had spent most of his life taking from the world, destroying and hurting and running. But here, in the final chapters of his story, he had found something worth giving to. Not redemption. He still did not claim that, still believed some sins were too great to be fully absolved. But purpose, peace. The possibility that a man's worst moments did not have to define all his moments. The stars were emerging now, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Emmett put his arm around Miguel's shoulders, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the night arrive. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more people to help, more challenges to face. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The hospital stood solid on its hill, lights glowing warm in its windows, a beacon for anyone who needed shelter from the storms of life. And in that light, in that warmth, in that promise of refuge and second chances, Emmett Cain had finally found his way home. Not forgiven, perhaps, but trying, always trying. And for a man with his history, that would have to be enough.